Britain in the 1930s was not always a happy place to be. The country faced economic hardship. Many battled with unprecedented levels of poverty, and the policymakers of the day were preoccupied with one central and crucial question: should Britain rearm her once mighty military ahead of what many believed would be a second Great War with Germany? Yet, despite this ongoing sense of foreboding, the months of 1936 were dominated by a question that seemed almost trivial. The newly installed king, Edward VIII, had fallen in love with the soon-to-be twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson, and he was determined to become husband number 3. In this debut season of our brand new podcast, we explore the abdication crisis, attempting to reconstruct events from available source material and solve the many mysteries that surround Britain's most recent royal revolution.
Hello, Royal History Geeks. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 7 of Royal Revolutions, where we continue our series on the abdication crisis of 1936. My name is Gareth Streeter. I am the creator of Royal History Geeks, and I am joined by royal commentator James Taylor. James, how are you this morning?
All right, thank you. Bit tired. It's been a busy week, but looking forward to this episode because we're reaching the climax now of the events of December 1936, and there's a lot to pack in.
There is a huge amount to pack in. And I, interestingly, when I was going through the notes for today's episode, I thought I might just drop you a message and say, there's so much, I think we should split this into 2 episodes. And then I thought, no, come on, we've got to at some stage actually get to the abdication. I think people are saying, this is brilliant, but when's he going to actually abdicate?
He's got to actually go, hasn't he?
Exactly. Well, you know my affection
he's got to
for
go
Edward
at some
VIII.
point.
I can't face it. One thing, just before we dive into today's chronology, I've been reviewing earlier episodes and looking at the things that we said. And one slight clarification I wanted to drop in, because I don't think it will come up at any other stage in the chronology. I probably should have mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. Earlier in the series, I said that Edward VIII, or the Duke of Windsor as he became, clearly took against the role that Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, played in what Edward would have seen as stirring the pot behind the scenes. I said at the time that I couldn't find a great deal of evidence for that, although it was broadly plausible, and perhaps some of it related to the king's suspicions rather than anything hard and fast. Since then, as we've continued to dive more and more into the detail, I've realised there is documented evidence that Cosmo Lang was reasonably active behind the scenes, talking about how the king may be losing a grip on his mental health, that he was perhaps drinking a little too much, both of which may have been valid interpretations of the king's behaviour at that time. So I'm not saying the Archbishop was necessarily acting maliciously, but he clearly was active, speaking to influential people about what he considered to be the king losing his way. So I think Edward did write with some justification that he was clearly in the other corner, if you like. So 2 weeks ago, because last week we paused the continuity to look specifically at the reactions of the royal family, but 2 weeks ago we ended where, after Wallis had once again tried to renounce David and get out of the situation and prevent the abdication, it had really become crystal clear in the king's mind that he had to go. He had to abdicate. He thought that for some time anyway, but at this stage, it was finally confirmed. And this became very clear to the government on the evening of the 8th of December, where the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, had arranged to go and meet the king at Fort Belvedere, the king's residence, the closest he had to a personal home. And it is quite clear that the Prime Minister intended to stay the night because he bought an overnight bag, but that had not been cleared in advance that the Prime Minister would stay the night. I must say, I don't know enough about the conventions of the day to know that if someone showed up at your house in the evening, would you expect them to stay the night? I don't know. Probably not, because you would quite often go for dinner. Fort Belvedere was a bit of a trek from Downing Street, so perhaps it could have been assumed, but it hadn't been cleared. And the Prime Minister's aide rather tactlessly just bought in the Prime Minister's overnight bag, which made it very clear he intended to stay the night, which provoked a reaction from the king, who kind of gathered people behind the scenes saying, I really don't want Stanley Baldwin to stay the night in my house, which I think when we were talking about this earlier, James, you're saying that clearly shows there's no love lost between the two now. However, it's probably also that the king is getting wise to the strategy of Baldwin, because Baldwin, and we will see this later on when we talk about how he manages his role in the abdication crisis when he presents it to third parties, wants to show that he did all he could to persuade the king to stay so that he doesn't get the blame for forcing the king out. And it is likely that as part of that story, he wanted to include an anecdote about how he had stayed all night with the king, pleading on him to reconsider, and the king didn't want to give him that opportunity. And I can't blame Edward for that.
No, nor can I. But I would say that I think that gives Edward more intelligence than we have hitherto given him credit for. That if he'd been able to see through that strategy of Baldwin's and refused to give him a bed for the night, refused to allow him to dine and sleep, as I believe it's called in smart circles.
Oh, right.
To have prevented that, yes, I think was actually quite clever.
I dined and slept at a Premier Inn the other day. That's quite smart. But it was one of their premium rooms, which just means the price of the Wi-Fi is built into the room cost.
Well, you see, I when I go to Windsor, I normally stay in the Holiday Inn Express, and because I get the members rate, and I get and so it's funny because when you go and say, "Hello, Mr. Taylor, it is nice to welcome you back here again."
You realise there are probably other royal commentators who are members of the Carlton Club and the National Liberal Club, but you're a member of the Holiday Inn Express. I like that. So the king does what, and some of the king's friends are saying, we'll just pack Baldwin off straight away. The king says, no, we can't possibly do that. I'll have dinner. And the Dukes of York and Kent are with the king in a moment of brotherly solidarity anyway, as are some other lawyers and advisors. So they throw together a makeshift dinner party, which presumably in a great house isn't that hard to do, because you just tell the cook to cook for more people. And they were presumably, if you're the cook for the king, even at his private residence, you're presumably fairly ready to scale up at short notice, I'd imagine.
Yes, and I think that you still have to remember that even fewer people and even though that was his private residence, there'd still be a certain level of formality. If you've got the Dukes of York and Kent there, you'd still be giving dinner on a certain scale, perhaps not the same as a state banquet, but it would be relatively easy then to stretch it. Then it's not like you or me with a coach party turning up outside.
Well, we're all right because I've just got an Audi just down the road, so we could just in the car would be an Audi in 5 minutes. So, but I don't suppose they did that at Fort Belvedere.
No, you see, we're terribly well appointed where I am because we've got an Aldi and a Lidl.
Well, we've got a little not far. We've got everything here. Don't you try and make me out to be some, provincial West Country chap.
No, I'm not. But I did expect that you'd have everything delivered from Fortnum's, as you're so far up the social scale.
I am quite high up the social scale. That's true. Anyway, so there proceeds to be a dinner party, which is surprisingly congenial. The king is at his glittering and charming best, probably because he's made his peace with what's going to happen. And I don't know about you, but I've certainly had occasions in the past where I've been dreading something terrible happening for some time. And actually, bizarrely, when it then does happen, even though it's the worst case scenario, there's still something that's lifted from you. And it feels like that's what's happening to the king here.
Yes, I agree. I think that if you are expecting some bad news in particular, and you know that it's coming, but there's still that slight doubt in your mind, you don't know. But then when you finally do know, even if the news is terrible, at least you know what you're dealing with. And so there is that sort of quite sense of relaxation that you're able then to just focus and deal with it.
So the king's being congenial at his glittering and glamouring best. of course, the effect this has on Paul Bertie, the Duke of York, who, as we know, is going to make a much more effective king than Edward, but he doesn't know that yet, and nobody else knows that yet. And all he is doing is seeing his brother excel in the part of life that Edward has always been far better at than Bertie. And Bertie's thinking, through a mix of brotherly love and through a mix of dread about what's to come, and through a mix, I guess, a kind of imposter syndrome, we can't let this man go. He's brilliant. Look at him. We can't lose this. And that I find that quite touching.
Well, they had been close, hadn't they, as young men, and they were only a year apart in age. And of course, Bertie had always accepted that his elder brother was going to be king. And I think there was that sense of dread as well. And as you say, we know that he turned out to be a much more dutiful king, but he wasn't as sparkling and as effervescent as his brother. And so I suppose that would have been quite daunting, especially for somebody who had always struggled with his speech impairment.
Yeah.
You know, he was not naturally at home in those public settings, but he was more at home with reading the state papers and with understanding the political nuances, which his brother wasn't particularly. So I think that it's, you know, they both have their strengths and their weaknesses.
Yes, and it's interesting to reflect, isn't it, how useful a skill is charisma for a constitutional monarch in I say today's world, I mean the last 150 years in a mass media age, because or does it just land you in trouble? Because if you think about the great successful constitutional sovereigns, we probably think of George V, George VI, and Elizabeth II, none of whom are necessarily people you would call charismatic, which is not to say they weren't funny or had good conversation skills or anything like that. Whereas when you think of the royals who you do see as more charismatic, Edward VIII, Diana, Princess of Wales, Princess Margaret, to an extent, the Duke of Sussex, has it helped them or has it been a curse rather than a blessing?
Maybe for them, but certainly I think if you say Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, she was much more charismatic. Said very little in public, but said it with such a degree of charisma and had that real sort of performance of an actress that she was always, right from being a young woman, always centre stage and always enjoyed being centre stage. And so I think that one has to remember that even if the Duke of York lacked that particular skill, he knew that having his wife by his side who did would be a great help to him.
Yes. So Baldwin leaves the fort that night, absolutely now convinced that the king is going to abdicate. In his mind, he'd been holding out for some time that the king wouldn't, which I think is something we should revisit at another time, because there's lots of different theories around what Baldwin was trying to get out of this. But it does seem that he'd had genuinely wanted the king to stay, but realizes on the evening of the 8th that he won't. He summons the cabinet the next morning for the 9th of December. I say summons. I'm not sure. It could be that the cabinet were due to meet anyway. I'm not sure. Or it could have been an extraordinary meeting. Doesn't really matter either way. And then he turns into what I call action Baldwin. You know, Baldwin could be known as a bit of a meanderer. It's like, right, the king is going. That's it. No more discussion. And I thought this is interesting. It must be done by midnight on Friday. This will not spill in to another weekend. And I think that's fascinating because when you think about what's got to be done, and we talk about, we normally talk quite critically of governments that are seen to rush through constitutional measures. New Labour got a lot of criticism for that, you know, guillotining debate in the House of Commons. Other more recent governments have had that as well over big issues. But when you think they've got to really think through the constitutions of how this works, because this is an unprecedented situation in every meaningful sense. You've got to draft legislation, you've got to get a new king ready, and he is saying, no, there must be a deadline. And I'm like, yeah, good for you, Baldwin, because I think he got that without that clear deadline, this could spill on for so long, and these questions would never be answered. What do you make to it?
Well, I agree. And I think you have to remember that there was also, as we discussed in a previous episode, the threat of the King's Party. Now, we know that was probably an exaggerated threat through the press, that there were certain sections of the press, the Rothermere press in particular, that were only printing positive stories about the king and about the amount of support he had. But I think that there was the risk that if it had gone on for longer, then it would cause more disquiet in the country, and that there could be but the potential for rioting in the streets. I'm not saying that that was ever going to be very likely.
But there's another issue that Baldwin is worried about. If he is worried about a situation where if the king abdicates and then doesn't marry Wallace, you might think, oh, well, that's wonderful because then the king's gone and you don't have this slightly inappropriate royal consort hanging about. But Baldwin was very worried that if that happened, he would then be seen as the man that forced the king out unnecessarily. And the tragedy of it all would be magnified with Baldwin being the pantomime baddie. And of course, there was this very real threat that the king wouldn't be able to marry Wallace, partly because, as we know, but Baldwin wouldn't have known. Wallace wasn't that keen on the idea. But even more seriously, there were lots of legal murmurings which were gathering pace in the days that we're talking about, which suggested the king's proctor would intervene unfavorably on the Simpson divorce case and declare it null and void, meaning the king couldn't marry Wallace Simpson. If you're not sure who the king's proctor was, check out the King's Party episode from 2 weeks ago where we talk about that more at depth. So Baldwin has an excruciatingly narrow tightrope to walk at this stage.
And I think you've got to say that he navigates this final part of it fairly successfully.
He does. I think that's partly because it worked. You know, when people take a bit of a gamble, and in politics, any leader has to take a bit of a risk and a gamble. And if it works, we think they're a genius. If it falls to pieces, we think they're an idiot. But actually, sometimes it's luck.
Well, and yes, and we talked about that in history before, about the winners are usually the ones who are lucky, not necessarily the people who've necessarily had the best strategy. But I think here, Baldwin was in a situation where, well, what else could he have done? I don't really think there was another conceivable course of action. Once it has been established that the king is going,
yes,
prolonging the agony would not have helped Baldwin. It wouldn't have helped the king. Wouldn't have helped the Duke of York. Wouldn't have helped anyone else. So I think probably it's best, do it and be done with it is probably the best strategy.
Absolutely. And then what happens after the cabinet meeting is basically it's almost like different sub-teams go into different strands of activity and start running a race to the finishing line to get various things done. So one chap from the cabinet is dispatched to go sort out the legislation. And I actually read the bill of abdication. Many will be familiar with the instrument of abdication, which we'll come on to talk about in a moment. But there was a bill that became an act of parliament that had to underpin that in all the Dominion countries. It's an incredibly short bill, which I guess makes sense. But you could imagine how it could have got very convoluted and going over this and that and all the others. But it doesn't. It's just got 3 clauses and simply clarifies that the king's going. The normal rules of succession will be followed. So it doesn't ever mention Albert, Duke of York in it, but it's just clear that the normal way of things will be followed. It's clear that the king's descendants will not be able to inherit the throne, which makes complete sense. It is in the spirit of the instrument of abdication. And it makes clear that the king is exempt from the Royal Marriages Act, which, of course, is something I hadn't particularly thought about. And we've talked about the Royal Marriages Act on different podcasts, but would have been a problem, very embarrassing for the new king. Is it worth just as quickly explaining what the Royal Marriages Act was or is, because it still exists?
Well, it does still exist, but of course the terms of it now have been greatly reduced, because now it's only the first 6 members in a line of succession that will have to formally request permission to marry from the sovereign. And it came in because of the 2 of George III's uncles had made what were considered to be unsuitable marriages. And so therefore they were then they had what were in effect morganatic marriages, although not really, because we don't have morganatic marriage in this country. We've talked about morganatic marriage before. But then an act of parliament was passed that every descendant of George II, apart from those descendants of females who had married into foreign royal houses, although again that's questionable because you did get a lot of, you had the descendants of the Hanovers, for example,
or of Queen Mary.
and of Queen Mary, or would then be having to ask for permission to marry
Hmm.
under the terms of the Royal Marriages Act. And so, if they were denied that permission to marry, then that meant that their marriage was deemed to be unlawful, and it also meant that certainly members of the royal family who are royal highnesses, one, were at risk of losing their style and title, although in effect it didn't usually, but there was the threat there that it could. But also there was the risk that they would lose any public funding, and so that was certainly one of the clauses that was held over Princess Margaret later when she was wanted to marry Peter Townsend, and they were only allowed to they had to ask permission if they were under the age of 25. Over the age of 25, they could give they could tell Parliament that they intended to marry without permission. You know, they no longer they couldn't be prevented from marrying, but they were prevented from leading a public life and receiving public funding.
I believe it was actually the Privy Council they had to give notice to, James, rather than Parliament. But you know.
Oh yes, it was. You're correct. Quite correct.
Deary me, deary me.
I stand corrected.
I think it's very, because with all this going on, it would have been quite believable and understandable if no one had remembered the Royal Marriages Act, because it didn't come up very often. And
no, it didn't.
But can you imagine the embarrassment it would have caused George VI if he had to either approve or not immediately allow? I know he could only delay it for a year. The marriage of Wallis Simpson, that would have put him in a terrible position. So probably some clever civil servant somewhere remembering it actually did him some huge favours.
It did, and what would have been even more embarrassing would have been if he had if he'd been forced to sign under the Royal Marriages Act, but then they also insisted that Wallis was not allowed to. They also deprived her of the style of Royal Highness, and so that would have been even more embarrassing, because if you've approved the marriage,
yes, you approved the marriage,
then you're saying that she can't exactly. But then you're saying that you're not approving of her having the same style and title as her husband. That gives an even bigger double standard than it might have appeared anyway.
It absolutely does, and all these things had to be thought about quickly because there's not much time, and this is really an unprecedented situation. You can argue there's been other abdications before in history, but this is really the first true example of someone voluntarily leaving their throne.
Well, not only that, it's also the first example under a constitutional monarchy, as opposed to an absolute system that would have been there in place in the Middle Ages.
Absolutely. Was it ever? Oh, that's a big debate. Absolute monarchy in the Middle Ages. Another podcast series.
Certainly compared to 1936, it would.
Yes, a much more powerful monarchy. So they need to actually work this process out, because it seems as if Edward seemed to believe he could just say, "I'm abdicating," and that was the end of it.
Yeah,
and now it's easy. Exactly. Now, it's easy to say, oh, how stupid. He didn't even know the constitutional setup. Well, one of the reasons that nerds like me know exactly what the constitutional setup is, because we all learned from this crisis. So, which is when it was really tested. So I don't think it's unreasonable to think that Edward didn't particularly know, because it was really a whole new situation. But the process was ironed out as Edward would sign an instrument of abdication, which was expressing his formal intention to leave the throne, and that would be sent to the parliaments of all the countries that he was king at, and it would be duly witnessed, and we'll talk about that, by senior members of the royal family. Each parliament or each government would then have to prepare a bill, which is clearly the same one that was prepared in London, and that bill would have to process through both houses of parliament in each country. Then the king, in his final act, would have to give royal assent to that bill, which means the king would be the one that would finally authorize his own abdication, because he was the only one that could, as his last expression of royal power. It is not the case, as is so often said in the media, that the sovereign actually signs acts of parliament. Royal assent is given through a ceremony in the House of Lords, where a representative of the king effectively goes and nods before the throne and says in Latin, "The king wills it," and that process happens automatically. So a sovereign would actually have to stop that happening to deprive royal assent. But nevertheless, it's ironic that the last act as king he would have to do was to declare himself not king any longer.
Indeed.
So that process is being ironed out. At the same time, different people are having conversations about what the future holds. So the king dispatches Monckton, his advisor, to meet with the Duke of York to negotiate what Edward's title will be upon abdication, which is interesting because I've always understood that the new status and new title for Edward upon leaving the throne was something that George VI very proactively insisted straight away should happen, which may be true, but it's interesting that the king did actually open negotiations for it before leaving the throne. So Monckton goes to George. Well, he's not George VI yet. He's still the Duke of York, and his opening gambit is he's still His Royal Highness Prince Edward because that's what you get for being the son of a king. And Monckton says you'd need to do another act of parliament to change that. I don't think that's true. I think by this stage, the governance of the HRH style through letters patent is established. So I think it would only have required letters patent to establish that. But nevertheless, it would have done, and no one wanted to do. So they seem to get to a consensus quite quickly that he should still be HRH Prince Edward. And then various different conversations go on. And I think the king is very minded, the Duke of York, when he becomes king, is minded that the former king should have the same status as his brothers and be a royal duke. But there's also a more constitutional element to wanting to ensure that Edward is made a duke. And that is because, and this is what the government were pushing behind the scenes, if he was not a duke, even as a prince, he's technically a commoner, which means he could stand for election in the House of Commons, i.e., he could become an MP. And that was something that the government were petrified about. If he's a peer, a duke, he's entitled to sit in the House of Lords, yes, but the House of Lords is not a powerful chamber. All he could do is sort of really go in and say, a bit with the other lords, and wouldn't really become. It was hard.
So what's it? What's it members of the House of Lords do?
But by 1936, it was difficult to
Just like
wield
to point
political
out,
power for the Lords.
I'd just like to point out, I did have a relative in the House of Lords at one point.
I know people in the House of Lords, and they're brilliant, but it is
And
not.
that's how they all sound, is it?
They all do.
Have you had to learn? Have you had to learn? Have you had to learn that you've become bilingual?
You get it when you get your letters patent. It's an etiquette sheet, and it teaches you. Anyway, the point is, by 1936, it's not really possible to wield significant political power from the House of Lords. In 1836, it still was, and we won't go into the reasons why now, but in a democratic state. So if you make Edward a duke, he can't run for parliament, and it's weird to think that was a real worry. But when you think about the fears there'd been around the King's Party, etc., and how much distrust there was for Edward as an unstable character, you can kind of see it. Of course, the other train of negotiation, which the king, but not just the king, everyone's interested in getting this right, but the king in particular cares about, is the money. How much money is he going to get off either the state or the royal family after leaving office? And the government have a difficult, again, tightrope to walk, because they recognise that if they say vote through Parliament a civil list annuity for the former king, there's going to be some public outcry over that, i.e., you abandoned us and now we're still paying for you. And it would have been more deferential in 1936 than it would have been in 1996, but it would still have been controversial. However, the government rightly understand, again, with this fear of a degree of potentially the Duke becoming a radical figure, that without some control over him, it's going to be very hard to exercise any kind of threat or do anything to enforce good behaviour. So they are quite interested in him being reasonably well paid after leaving office. And the way it seems to be broadly settled, although without any detail, and again, I think they were clear they didn't want too much detail because they wanted there to be some ambiguity to keep him behaving well, but was that the new king would pay him out of the privy purse rather than public funds. Quite a high settlement, and it would end up being about 25,000 a year, which is about 3 or 4 million by today's money.
And of course, there was the sale of the estates of Sandringham and Balmoral.
And that's the big negotiating point that Monckton gets that the king has. And it's worth just explaining that was when the king, Edward VIII, inherited, if you like, the royal estate. Some things he inherited because they were part of the Crown lands, which were the Duchy of Lancaster. You've got the Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, all of those things that we associate with the monarchy. But there were other estates, the two most significant ones being Balmoral in Scotland, which had been purchased by Queen Victoria, and Sandringham, which had been purchased by Edward VII, I want to
Well,
say.
it was purchased. It was purchased by Victoria and Albert for him ahead of his
Right,
marriage.
right, I see. And they are both private purchases that those people made as individuals rather than as the sovereign. So Edward VIII inherited them as the eldest son of George V rather than as king, which meant he was not necessarily renouncing those properties, but those properties have become synonymous with royal life.
Yes, and I mean they've not been entailed to the crown. So
No,
if he had chosen to keep control of both Sandringham and Balmoral, he would have been well within his legal right to do so.
Legally, he was absolutely within his rights. And that's his big negotiating position. It's like transfer them over to us and we'll look after you financially. But what he is not open about, and this would sour the relationship to an extent between the two brothers later, was that while he was Prince of Wales and had access to the Duchy of Cornwall revenues, he built up a pretty good nest egg of about 1 million, which is many, many, many millions more in today's money, which frankly, which would have given him an annual income, conservatively, would have given him an annual income of £30,000, which would have been several million in today's money. So he was never going to be hard up. And that, again, I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that if everyone had known that, he wouldn't have got a dime, because the government did like the idea of him being dependent on the crown and the government for money. They did like that, but he wouldn't necessarily have got what he got.
No, and I think it's more relevant that if he had retained Sandringham and Balmoral, that there was always the risk, even if there wasn't the reality, of him going to live in either of those or going to stay there for extended periods. And
or entertain Nazis there. Let's be clear about what some of the figures were of him.
Well, not just Nazis, but I mean fascists more generally.
Yeah.
Both in this country, because he was known to have fascists as close friends, but also in Europe with, if you look at both Mussolini and Franco, I'm not saying he was close to either of those, but there was the real risk of entertaining people whose positions would have been alien to the government.
So the other thing they needed to talk about, or not really talk about, but the king needed to decide, was where he was going to live. As we have talked about, he couldn't go and join Wallace because Wallace was still technically speaking married to another man. And if anything happened to jeopardize the divorce case, which was already seeming quite possible, then it would be game over for everyone, really, because nobody wanted a situation at this stage where the king couldn't marry Wallace, for the simple reason that he'd probably just gone and lived with her in open adultery. And that it is difficult for us to get our heads round now, but that would have been a game over scandal, possibly for royalty. But going back to where he was going to live, his original plan seems to have been to go to Switzerland, where he would stay at a hotel. And this seems to have been lined up a little bit earlier, kind of a week and a half before, where there was still a vague plan from the King's party to get the king out of the country and give the country time to reflect on whether or not he should marry Wallace. But that seems to be now where he's going. And Wallace seems to get wind of this, and she seems to intervene and arrange for him to stay with friends for a period of time. And actually, that's nice because there's some degree of concern there, because I think we've been encountering during this whole series that perhaps Wallace wasn't overly enthralled by David or had that much affection or love for him, but there does seem to be some aspects to which she seems to have shown some care, and that's just a little comforting, I suppose. Let's talk about all the conversations that were going on and the activities of the Duke of York, because of course he's the other central figure in this now, and that he's literally about to become king in about 48 hours. What's he up to?
Well, he's quite lonely at this point because he's not got the support of the Duchess of York, later Queen Elizabeth, in any physical sense, because she's ill in bed with influenza, and she just seemed to have been rather unlucky in her younger years with illnesses like that. She would go down with flu, with heavy colds, with throat infections, and she'd also had pneumonia at the beginning of the year when George V had died, and although she had been well enough to attend the funeral, it had been sort of touch and go because she had been really rather ill. She'd missed the George V's final Christmas at Sandringham, for example, because she was ill in bed at home. But she is out of the picture at the moment. But the king does, or the king to be rather, does need some comfort. So he goes to his mother, to Queen Mary, and we've said about how Queen Mary was not particularly an affectionate person, and indeed her grandson Lord Harwood did describe her as quite buttoned up. But the king, George VI, the future George VI, goes to her and completely breaks down in her arms. And at that moment, she's loving him, comforting him, giving him that support. And I think that for me, that is the moment when, because we know that Queen Mary never lost affection for her eldest son. She writes affectionate letters to him afterwards. But this is when she completely transforms all of the respect, all of the duty in her goes towards her second son as king. She had made one of her first actions when her husband had died was to curtsy to her elder son as king, because and to say to him, God save the king. Now she's transferring all of that without question to her second son, and she's comforting him, but she's also giving him that steel and that backbone that I think he probably needed at that point, because I'm not saying that there's no record of the Duke of York trying to get out of becoming king. Once he knows that his brother's going, he accepts it. There's no real thought that he's wanting to pass it on to one of his brothers, even though there's the wild suggestion out there that the Duke of Kent might become king because he has a son. Nevertheless, though, it's still a large undertaking for him, and he's overawed, and so he wants that comfort, and his mother is the one to give that to him. And I think that also says a lot about Queen Mary herself, because we've heard about her being so emotionally remote, and yet here she is, she's loving and comforting her son, and it's probably not what people might expect of her.
And indeed, she's going to continue to play an interesting role in the days to come. The 10th of December is a huge day where a number of things happen. And fairly into mid-morning, the royal brothers gather, which is, just to recap, obviously there's still the current king, Edward VIII, Albert, Duke of York, Bertie, as we normally speak to him about, the soon-to-be George VI, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, who we haven't talked much about because he wasn't particularly involved or particularly close to Edward VIII.
No, he was still a serving officer in the army at this point, and the abdication would mean him having to leave his role as a serving officer, but he's been in Aldershot, so he's not been in any way involved. We did talk very briefly about Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, his wife of just over a year at this point, having been at Marlborough House with Queen Mary. So she's had a very small walk-on part in this, but yes, you're right, Henry's had no part at all.
Yes, none at all. He'd been told previously, but hadn't made much of it. Then George, Duke of Kent, arrives late, which the Duke of Windsor, who seemed to have an affectionate relationship, a good relationship across the board with the Duke of Kent, finds almost comical. Well, of course, George would be late, kind of thing, which is very much a sort of younger brother role to play. Interestingly, we talked last week about there had been some speculation that some people thought perhaps George, Duke of Kent, who was the only one with a son at this stage, should become king, not Albert, because he only had daughters. Interestingly, it's something I remember reading about when I read books about the 1930s when I was a boy, and there is some, I've Googled, and there are some references to it, but all the two or three quite weighty books that I've read about looking at the government documents around the abdication crisis really don't mention it. And I keep going back to the index to look at Kent, Duke of, to just check I've read all the references, and they don't seem to be there. Again, it does look like it was said by some. I said last week I assumed it was said on the floor of the House of Commons, but I don't think it was, even though Hansard isn't fully up to date online. I might have to go to an archive at some point to read it properly. And but it seems that it was actually said not in Parliament, but some civil servant just mentioned it while they were preparing the legislation. I really think it was a throwaway comment that someone minuted because they were minuting everything. And it's a bit like occasionally now there'll be a headline under, when documents get released, it's like the Blair government considered legalizing cocaine. And when you read into it, they didn't. It's just someone said as an offhand comment in a meeting, it would be the same as legalizing cocaine, and someone writes it up. And
yes.
So all the brothers are present. The job now is for the king to sign multiple copies of the instrument of abdication, and then each of the brothers signs one. Signs them all as well. And we probably, many people will have seen, you could certainly Google it, we'll see a copy and you'll see all of the four brothers' signatures there, with, of course, Edward signing as Edward RI for the last time.
The very last time, yes.
And the Duke of York, the future George VI, signing as Albert for the last time. He would, of course, thereafter sign, well, at least until 1947, sign as George RI. So that's an interesting document just for the sake of it. They actually signed, I think it was about 25 copies in the end, because there needed to be a copy, not just for each country, each dominion, which had to vote on this, but for each Houses of Parliament. So there were multiple Houses of Parliament in different countries, as indeed there are in the UK. So I think in total it was something, it was something over 20. I can't remember the exact number, but that would have taken a while. And then these were dispatched to Parliament. I believe the brothers remained behind and spent some time. I think even at this stage, some sources say Bertie was still pleading with his brother not to go, which is unfathomable. I mean, constitutionally, I don't think it could have been revoked at this stage, really.
Well, no, I think that ship had certainly sailed, if not literally, certainly metaphorically, because if you've signed all of those instruments of abdication, there's no going back. And I think he would have known that.
So perhaps Bertie does think it's still retrievable. And technically speaking, it is. Until the Acts receive royal assent, Edward remains king. So, and this has yet to go through any parliament. So perhaps it could be withdrawn, but it seems like a last dash hope, which perhaps owes more to desperation than to common sense at this stage. But I think we could probably all forgive him for that.
Well, and also I think it does build into this narrative that there was at the time that he was a very reluctant king, which I think is true to an extent. But I think that the extent to which we can read in some contemporary sources that he was a trembling wreck, I'm not sure that is precisely true either. I know that we've spoken earlier about how he had broken down his mother's arms, and I think that one can forgive him for that, given that it was a great shock and a lot to take on. But I think that from everything that we see of George VI in the coming days and weeks, that he, although shell-shocked, takes it on with the sense of duty that certainly his parents and certainly his mother would have instilled in him and expected of him.
I think as well, this is a very human situation, but there are so many situations which we dread, but the dreading is the worst bit. When you're actually in it, whether it's good or bad, you just cope, don't you?
Whereas well, you have no choice. You get to a point. You get to a point where even if a situation is terrible, if you're going to receive bad news, for example, you're going to receive bad news. Once you have received it, there's a sort of release of a certain amount of tension, because then at least you know what you're dealing with and you can just focus on it. Whereas when there are certain unknown factors, you're still then thinking, well, what if it doesn't happen? And what if we have to do this? Or whereas now he knows that he is going to be king and there's no going back. So he then takes it on and deals with it. And that's the impression that we get from the pronouncements that are made not only by him, but by people around him at that point. And yes, you can argue that they would say that because there was no choice. But I think there is an element of truth in it.
I think so as well. So the instrument of abdication has gone off to the British Parliament, and not unexpectedly perhaps, but we'll be covering
in greater depth what happened in the British Parliament, as this was where all the eyes were focused. There is a meeting of the House of Commons that evening. The House is in session. It's not an extraordinary meeting, but a new item is added for discussion toward the end of the day, which is, of course, the instrument of abdication from Edward VIII, which will turn into a bill which needs to pass both houses of Parliament very quickly. And the British Parliament is capable of rushing legislation through at exceptional speed when it needs to, particularly reasonably straightforward legislation like the bill that's put in front of them. Baldwin stands up to address the House of Commons. And what's quite interesting, today we are used to front bench speeches from members of the government being scripted. They are delivered with great skill. If you look at politicians, whatever you think of them in terms of their policies, they are really quite skilled at speaking from a script, but breaking off from that script and commenting on other things, taking interventions, factoring in comments people make. It really is quite an impressive skill. But actually, that's reasonably new. By new, I mean sort of 1970s media age way of doing Parliament. Prior to that, you really weren't meant to speak from a script at all. Indeed, backbenchers can still get called out by the Speaker today if they're reading from a script rather than speaking from notes, as you're not meant to do that in the House of Commons. So Baldwin didn't have a set text with him. He had a series of different notes. There is stories beforehand how his notes were getting muddled up. He was sent a note from the king with a particular request to ask everyone to show support to the Duke of York, which Baldwin does include, and then a note saying, please make it very clear that this is not Mrs. Simpson's idea. She's been trying to get me to do it. This is all my idea, which Baldwin doesn't include. Whether that's an intention, whether just because he sort of forgets the note. I mean, there is a genuine...
And also, I think you have to bear in mind that Baldwin did only have a certain amount of time to be able to say all these things in as well.
About 50 minutes he speaks for, so he probably could have squeezed it in if he'd wanted to. But I think he may have decided this just isn't wise to bring up Mrs. Simpson explicitly in the House, although others would in the debate.
Yes.
Or he may just literally, you've got, what it's like, someone's had you a whole load of scraps of bits of paper. You just sort of forget. Who knows? It's really interesting that Baldwin is not, generally speaking, remembered as a great orator, in the way that, of course, Churchill, his successor but one as Prime Minister, would be. And Alexander Lerman, in his book, also says that Baldwin is generally remembered as a second-rate Prime Minister, or in the second division of Prime Ministers. Yet this speech was perhaps his crowning glory, because he delivers a masterpiece of a speech which, had anyone been in any doubt as to whether there would be a problem getting this bill through Parliament, they would be in no doubt after Baldwin's speech. And what is so masterful about it is partly as a construction, which was largely off the hoof, it reads incredibly well, and it's incredibly succinct and quite inspiring and quite poetic. But also, it does a remarkable job in making the king come out of it quite well, and in making Baldwin come out of it quite well. And this speech is the speech that constructs the narrative of the abdication crisis, which most of us who are roughly our sort of age and older at least have grown up knowing, which is that the king fell in love with a woman who he recognized and everyone else recognized could never be queen. His wife would be queen. So while everybody had a human understanding of course you want to be with the woman you love, everyone recognized he had to go. And it was a tragic, romantic tale that everyone all quite cordially agreed needed to be managed well, which ended up being managed well. And that, as listeners of this podcast will know, is a far more straightforward narrative than the reality, which is why, as Adrian Phillips said to me, people described Stanley Baldwin in this speech as lying like a gentleman, which I think is a very good way of putting it.
Yeah. I think one other thing to remember about Baldwin is that this is right at the end of his political career, certainly of his premiership, because he had made it known that he was intending to resign at the time of the coronation, whoever was being crowned. I mean, that wasn't just because of George VI was being crowned after the abdication. So I think as well that you have to remember that one, he has the experience of a kind of elder statesman by this point, but also the fact that there was probably this thought. I'm not saying this was his primary motive, but probably also this thought of, I'm never going to be able to top this now. It's going out not so much on a high, but with it's your chance to set the agenda for how your political legacy is going to be remembered.
Absolutely.
And I think that you have to remember that when you look at Baldwin's words here, it's more than just him as the Prime Minister and being an honest broker or trying to position himself as an honest broker. It's also his opportunity to shape that legacy. And I think that he does quite masterfully.
So Baldwin makes a speech. You then get the debate proceeding within the House of Commons before ultimately going on to vote on the legislation. There are two concerns for the government during the debate and the legislation. One is the communist faction, which is effectively a splintered off group of the Labour Party, the Independent Labour Party, some of whom were explicitly identifying as communists at this stage. They do speak in the debate, and they basically say two things, which I think is fascinating. They see this as an opportunity to say, well, hasn't monarchy had its day? This just goes to show monarchy isn't suited for the modern world. To which they shout, no, in sort of House of Commons, classic speech in the way that happens now, or House of Commons classic theatre in the way that happens now. And the other thing is, it's only these communist MPs that mention on the floor of the House that they believe Mrs. Simpson, who they mention by name, whereas others don't, is effectively a German Nazi sympathizer, which they say in only the most thinly veiled of language. And we were chatting about this before, James, but it just goes to show whether there was really any founded truth in that speculation about Mrs. Simpson and her sympathies or not. It's interesting to see that it was contemporary and it was recorded and mentioned in Parliament in 1936.
Well, I think that it shows that those things were being said at the time. The only thing I question is whether it goes too much with the grain, that it suits their narrative to say all of that about her at this point. I'm not quite sure how widespread those comments were, and also the extent to which Wallis is perhaps being singled out for. I mean, we know that she was a regular visitor to the German embassy, and that she had quite a relatively close relationship with von Ribbentrop. But a lot of people did go there socially at the time, and how many of them shared those political sympathies, or however many of them were just there because it was the social scene at the time, I think is open to question. But I think that we'll probably look a bit more about the Windsors and their closeness with the Nazis and with the fascists, because they did certainly have a lot of fascist friends and sympathizers in this country as well. So it's a big topic, and I'm certainly not saying that what they're saying isn't true. I'm just saying I think that the fact that they use it at this point is suiting their narrative to do it.
Yes, to be explored more fully. The other group that the government are worried about is a group on the right, effectively a subgroup within the Conservative Party known as the Imperial Policy Group, which is kind of like the 1936 equivalent of the European Research Group, I think. I'm not suggesting the European Research Group had fascist sympathies, but I mean a group within a group is the analogy I'm trying to make there. And they seem to be very keen to support the king. They had written, some of them, to the king saying, we would support you in the form of a king's party. And there's a huge worry that they're going to vote against the bill. There's not enough of them to bring the bill down, but it would obviously be embarrassing if the bill doesn't pass well. What is interesting is the government, the chief whip and others meet with members of the Imperial Policy Group ahead of the vote. And somehow they say something to them or give them some information that causes this group to fall into line, which has led to much speculation over the years that this is where Baldwin shared the China dossier on Wallis Simpson and discredited Mrs. Simpson in the eyes of these MPs. For people who don't know what we're talking about, go back to episode 1, where we discuss the supposed, probably fabled China dossier, which is supposed to have captured information about what Mrs. Simpson got up to during her year in China, which was sexually deviant and in other ways exotic and colourful. Interestingly, Adrian Phillip, he doesn't put much store in the existence of the China dossier, at least not in any way that's as sensational as others have made it. He thinks it's probably more likely that information with Mrs. Simpson was shared, but it was more about her supposed affairs with younger men in this country from the time that she was under surveillance by Special Branch, and that information was enough to scare them off. Who knows? So, as well as there being these fractious groups present in the debate and potentially going to vote against, although in the end they don't, the bill passes with only 5 people voting against it, which are the communists who don't want to vote for it because they just don't want to effectively endorse the line of succession because they're Republicans. Another person watching, which we talked about earlier, although I never know at this stage what I'll have edited out by the time we get here, was Queen Mary was actually watching the debate from the Peers Gallery, which is a highly unusual move for a Dowager Queen to make.
Extremely rare. And I think that shows, and more than anything, that Queen Mary was somebody who, although she was very dutiful, knew when it was going to be an opportune moment to break the rules that she'd always imposed on herself. Because if we look later, she goes to the coronation, which was unprecedented for a Queen Dowager. I think that, you can question what her motives were here for going, because I certainly think she had no joy in what she was hearing. But I think that because she knew it was such a momentous event, not only for her immediate family, but also in British history, that she felt that she needed to be there for it.
I think my read on this, and it's only a read, I don't know, but it seems to me, because I think the point you just made, James, about Queen Mary being present at George VI's coronation as a sign of support, shows that Queen Mary, who in many ways was the inventor of the House of Windsor and the modern aspects of royalty, I think she understood how, in exactly the same way that her granddaughter Elizabeth II would understand, how sometimes just being present makes a statement without in any way entering a debate or being inappropriate with your words. Just being present makes a statement.
And Queen Mary was not heard to say anything publicly about the abdication. She didn't even make public statements in favour of her second son at this point, although it's obvious that because she attended the coronation, whatever, that she was supportive of her second son and her daughter-in-law. But she's very careful not to make any public utterances. She plays it all with a straight bat, but it's clear that she is very engaged. And also, you have to bear in mind that Queen Mary is 69 by this point, that she's still showing herself to be a key player within the royal family. And I'm not suggesting that she's doing it to prove that to anyone else, just that the fact that her husband has died and she's no longer queen consort does not mean that she's a spent force. And I think the fact that she's there is demonstrating that she's still right at the middle and at the heart of the family.
She is the only one that could convey a certain message, because she is Edward VIII's mother. And I think that by being present, she is saying to the world, yes, he is my son, but if there has been a conflict between Baldwin and Edward, I want you to know the royal family agree with Baldwin. I think she's sort of saying that. The bill does proceed very comfortably through Parliament. Just 5 MPs vote against it, and that's because they were communists not wanting to be seen to endorse the line of succession, a concept they don't agree with anyway. However, that is not enough to end the reign of Edward VIII. The only thing that could do that is the bill passing through both houses of Parliament and then being given royal assent. So on the 11th of December, the next day, that's precisely what happens. And royal assent is given to the abdication bill at 1:52 p.m, the precise moment that the reign of Edward VIII ends and the reign of George VI begins. That is the end of Edward's reign. However, it is not the end of our story, because quite famously, later that evening, he finally is allowed to speak to the people in the form of a broadcast. And that broadcast, I think, is probably one that many people will have heard snippets of in the past.
I think it's probably one of the most famous broadcasts that's been made in history, because it's been repeated so many times. And I think most people could be able to quote at least parts of it by heart.
I think they could. And it's interesting that it begins, I'll read out the text in a minute, but it begins, "At long last, I'm able to say a few words of my own." And that's interesting, because when I'd heard that before, I thought, oh, he just must have felt stifled. I didn't realize they'd had a plan. There'd been a plan for him to broadcast earlier to the people when he was still king. And that was overturned by the government. They wouldn't hear of it. So that kind of adds a bit of context to that I'd previously dismissed, perhaps. There was, we were talking about this earlier, some dispute as to what his title would be when he gives the broadcast. He would be made a royal duke, but that hasn't happened yet. There was a sense that George VI, although king from 152 that day, shouldn't really be exercising the royal prerogative until he'd been sworn in, which hadn't happened by this stage. It would happen, I think, the next day. So there was a reluctance for him to formally give Edward a title. So there was a discussion as to what that title should be. The BBC had said, well, is he just Mr. Edward Windsor? Everyone said, no, it can't be that. Monckton had said he is His Royal Highness Prince Edward as the son of a king. It would take another Act of Parliament to take that away from him. I don't think it would have taken an Act of Parliament. I think letters patent could have done it. But yes, as the son of a king, under the letters patent of 1917, he was His Royal Highness Prince Edward. And that's indeed how he was introduced in ahead of the broadcast. So what I'm going to do now is just read the text, and I'm not going to try and do it in his voice, even though I've heard the text being read by him myself. "At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor, and now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. This I do with all my heart. You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne. But I want you to understand that in making up my mind, I did not forget the country or the empire which, as Prince of Wales, and lately as king, I have for 25 years tried to serve. But you must believe me when I tell you that I found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. And I want you to know that the decision I have made has been mine and mine alone. This was a thing I had to judge entirely for myself. The other person, most nearly concerned, has tried up to the last to persuade me to take a different course. I have made this the most serious decision of my life only upon the single thought of what would, in the end, be best for all. The decision has been made less difficult to me by the sure knowledge that my brother, with his long training in the public affairs of this country, and with his fine qualities, will be able to take my place forthwith without interruption or injury to the life and progress of the empire. And he has one matchless blessing, enjoyed by so many of you, and not bestowed on me, a happy home with his wife and children. During these hard days, I have been comforted by Her Majesty my mother, and by my family. The ministers of the Crown, and in particular Mr. Baldwin, the Prime Minister, have always treated me with full consideration. There has never been any constitutional difference between me and them, and between me and Parliament. Bred in the constitutional tradition by my father, I should never have allowed any such issue to arise. Ever since I was Prince of Wales, and later on when I occupied the throne, I have been treated with the greatest kindness by all classes of the people, wherever I have lived or journeyed through the empire. For that I am very grateful. I now quit altogether public affairs, and I lay down my burden. It may be some time before I return to my native land, but I shall always follow the fortunes of the British race and empire with profound interest, and if at any time in the future I could be found of service to his majesty in private station, I shall not fail. And now we all have a new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king. What an absolute masterpiece.
Yeah, but do you know what really struck me when you read that out? Because you'd said that you were just going to read it, you wouldn't attempt to try and deliver it in the same fashion, but yet there was that same emphasis, burden of responsibility as I would wish to do, and that came out without any attempt to try and.
It's because he says that so profoundly, doesn't he? That I couldn't not say it like that.
Yeah, it is, and I think that no matter how many times you hear it, it's still very striking, and its honesty is well, I suppose one can question how honest, but certainly not shying away from those difficult questions, those difficult issues.
Exactly, and I mean, he reminds me a little bit of a politician who finds his voice in his or her resignation statement in a way they never found when they were in government, which many have done. And there's a few things I want to say about it, just a few technical notes. The first thing is we understand this, frankly, quite untrue comment that there'd never been any difference between him and his ministers, and Mr. Baldwin had treated him with full consideration. Baldwin had specifically asked via an intermediary to include a line of compliment to Baldwin, which again, it's almost like a quid pro quo. I kind of made out we were all mates when I did mine. You've got to do the same to me. And apparently the king was reluctant to, but in the end decided that he should. And I think that's quite interesting.
Well, it is, because he could easily not have done, and it wouldn't have led to any real detriment to him. You know, he was going anyway. He didn't. The Baldwin was not in a position where he could force him to do that any longer.
Not at all. And I think it's interesting. It's what we were saying earlier about how minded, and you said this very well, James, how minded Baldwin was to his legacy, to the point of being quite keen to slip these things in. And although I think we've both accused the king or Edward VIII of being a dissembler at parts in this process, so was Baldwin, and I think that's really important to remember.
Well, and having said criticise, I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing that they had both dissembled in parts of this, because I think that they needed the time to regroup, the time to think, all of those things. I'm just saying that you can say that neither of them were particularly decisive at certain points when it suited them not to be.
Another point I'd make, this point that comes out quite strongly here, which is not the bit that normally you hear in snippets, because it doesn't necessarily translate that well to the modern ear, but where he says there's bred in the constitutional traditions by my father, which was apparently a Churchill edition, that phraseology, I should never have allowed any issues to arise, i.e. I would never have allowed a constitutional crisis to develop. What's important about that is that through the rest of his days, it's very important to Edward or David that he maintains this was never a constitutional crisis. I had the decency, whatever else you think of me, I had the decency to only push it so far, and I would never actually have jeopardized the British Constitution to pursue what I wanted. Now, I think that's a comment which requires context, because I think he may be overgenerous to himself, but I don't think it's a complete fabrication either. And whatever I would say about him, I'd have to give him some credit for that. The final point I would make is, we talked about this in episode 5 where we discussed the broadcast, and I said I felt it had Churchillian authorship, and this broadcast is very much the successor to that draft. I think I may have been a bit unfair both on Monckton, who I think was probably quite involved in the wordsmithing of itself, and I may even have been a little bit unfair on Edward VIII, because there is some evidence that, to be explored in another time, that he contributed to his own memoirs more proactively than I had initially thought, and may have actually had a bit of a way with words himself. So I feel it's so interesting, and maybe this is we'll reflect on another episode about who we think Edward VIII was. But having been through a cycle where I began this process with a low opinion of him, as we began researching, I developed an even lower opinion of him. As he ends at this point in 1936, my opinion of him rises slightly. I believe as we explore the sources for the decade to come, it will be tarnished beyond all salvation. But at this point, there's something respectable in the way he's conducting himself, and I admire that.
Yeah, but even people that we don't like do things that we approve of sometimes.
Exactly. A stuck clock is right twice a day, kind of.
Right,
But
quite.
I mean, that's it, really. That should be the end of the abdication crisis. It's not going to be the end of the series, because we're going to talk a bit about the aftermath next week. Then we're going to have some questions. Then we're going to pause for a couple of weeks while we get our heads together and then do some reflections. But this is, the king has abdicated. James, at this stage, are there any reflections you want to share?
He's finally gone, because it's taken, although we've reflected several times that this happened, the crisis was only probably about 6 weeks long. There was an awful lot of things going on. And I think that for you and I, we've had to remember at times, keep a lot of details in our head. How difficult would it have been for anybody who was closely involved in that crisis?
But we better pause it there for this week. We will be back next week to talk about the aftermath of the crisis in a very big overview sense. There'll need to be far more to really look at the aftermath, I think, and we'll explore that in the future. We're then going to take questions. We're going to have a whole episode of questions. So please, many of you have already been in touch with questions, but please send more our way. All the details will come up in a minute about how you get in touch with us. But until then, we will see you next week.
Goodbye.
Royal Revolutions is a Royal History Geeks podcast. For more information about our other podcasts, head to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts. The Royal History Geeks community is active across Facebook, X, YouTube, Instagram, and Discord. Just search for Royal History Geeks on your social platform of choice, and you should find us there. The first episode of Royal Revolutions dropped in December 2024. The entire first season will focus on the abdication crisis. Toward the end of season 1, we will devote an entire episode to questions, so please get in touch with us via our socials or at royalhistorygeeks@gmail.com to send any questions about the abdication crisis our way.